Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another amazing Saturday session. It's like a big gap in my heart when we miss a day, so I'm sorry that we missed Tuesday, but alhamdulillah, always happy to be here. I wanted to just call attention to an amazing khutbah from yesterday. A lot of times most times I don't really know what Sheikh is going to talk about, and I don't know, like when I sit and I start hearing, I don't know if it's the troublemaker in me or maybe the social justice part of me, but when I start hearing like what he is laying out, I get very excited. And yesterday was, it was a very challenging and controversial khutbah, but an extremely important khutbah, and I got really excited because I imagined that probably no other Friday khutbah would be talking about this topic. And so it's about abuse, about sexual abuse, about our Islamic community, how a lot of people are silent, about what happens to the rights of the victims. And clearly, we had recently an issue within our Muslim community about someone who had committed some alleged abuse against women, but after he passed away, how there was this strange dynamic of people honoring him, but then a lot of women feeling very, not sure how to deal with this issue because they recognized that someone who had been allegedly accused of abuse was now getting honored with, as if all of that other stuff was just swept away to the side, and it was supposed to be understood that this is the Islamic way of handling this situation. So Sheikh very boldly and addressed this issue through the technical aspects and also the moral aspects. And so if you didn't have a chance to watch it, I would highly encourage you to go back, and I know we're sharing some clips from it on social media. So it's just, it's one of those things where it makes me really sad to hear the topic, but proud at the same time, because when you hear the truth and the evidence and the morality that should go behind how we as Muslims should react to the situation, it's a very cleansing and beautiful experience. It's empowering. And I think there's been a lot of confusion about how we should respond to these types of situations. So I think these types of khutbahs are really what set us apart, because I don't think most people want to even touch this topic in any Islamic space, much less delve in and talk about the hadith that people are throwing around to support certain positions, and also to address like certain attitudes that people have in these situations. So it's a very important education. And I think it also is probably, very comforting for people who have been victims in those situations. And it helps, I think, to align the community around, what is the moral stance in these very difficult situations. So when we cover topics that are unique and so important and controversial, it makes me very proud to be part of the Suli Institute, and very grateful to the Sheikh, who's brave enough to tackle this topic. So I would encourage you to watch it if you haven't. And it's really lovely because I've noticed an uptick in really beautiful messages that we receive. And it's actually, let me go back and say something about yesterday's khutbah. What was interesting is I had to leave partway through because I had to go pick up our son. But so I continued to watch on the live stream, and I happened to see some of the comments that people were posting. And there were a lot of, very encouraging, people were excited to hear this topic being raised. But then someone from India also wrote and was angry and said, how could it be that you are continually talking about these feminist issues? Why aren't you talking about this thing that happened in India on this farm where, it affected 100 families? And it's sort of interesting because on the one hand, I felt like, gosh, this is such a brave and bold khutbah. The fact that it's even out there is something that is stunning and unique and unusual. And to have an angry reaction about, why are you continuing to push this feminist agenda? Well, abuse obviously happens to both men and women, and it's not a point of feminist agenda. But then, and then also, it was interesting because this person was angry that we weren't talking about something that was clearly important to them. But then I thought, this is actually really beautiful, because it's like someone who came to our site, to the Usuli site, looking for, Sheikh to speak about an injustice, and it's, we're in America, we're not in India, we're not necessarily, I know Sheikh is actually very aware of issues around the world, But to have an expectation to come to an institute, a khutbah, and say, why aren't you speaking about this issue in India, is kind of out there. But in a sense, it's like, wow, okay, you came all the way from there to raise this issue because you felt like you would get, a just point of view. And I think that's beautiful, that it's from clearly around the world, and, it was someplace where they felt they could get, someone with a bold voice. So, it's interesting, right? But to me, it's a very positive sign. But anyway, I am getting so many emails from people that are, I've shared some here before about how beautiful they are, because people really write about what they come across the Suli Institute, they find what we're doing, and that it has really been life transforming for them. A lot of people have been struggling with their faith. They, are so overjoyed to hear someone speaking in a way that they connect with. And it kind of comes back to like what the Sheikh said at the end of the khutbah yesterday, which is, this is what truth sounds like, and I think that is such a beautiful, short statement for, I think, one of the ways that we make a difference. I feel like when people hear truth, it touches them, in a very deep way. They recognize it from their soul, and that's why it really hits. And when you hear that, it's just, it's a feeling like no other. I think people, they can feel when, you can feel when you're hearing BS. You can feel it viscerally when you're hearing someone cutting corners, or, someone who just doesn't really quite know what they're saying, or, hypocrisy. People have a sensor for that, but they also have a very strong sensor for truth. And so I think when what we do touches that, it's really powerful. And so I'm really grateful that the Sheikh continues to be, really bold and, fearless with the truth. So please share the message with other people. I know, abuse is one of these things that touches every family, every friend group, everyone in the Islamic community in one way, shape, or form. I think that this was an incredible, powerful, enlightening, and liberating khutbah that can give a lot of people comfort and direction. So please share it with others and enjoy it. So, not enjoy it, but learn from it. So thank you, and I'm so excited. We now, actually, this is interesting, this is going to be the first Medinan Surah that we're covering. So we have one Meccan Surah that we didn't cover. We all were like thinking that maybe that would be what we covered today, but upon prayer, it's like, no, welcome to Medina. So looking forward to an amazing session.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. سبحان الله العلي العظيم والصلاة والسلام على محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن اتبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي يا رب العالمين. So, inshallah, today we talk about Surah Al-Insan. This surah, although it's fairly short, but as we will see, it has a powerful message to deliver. But first, let's situate the surah. Surah Al-Insan is one of the surah that's actually difficult to place. So we know that although eventually the consensus was that the surah is titled Surah Al-Insan, or which translates basically human beings or humans. It was there were in circulations where proposed names, other names for the surah, like Surah Al-Dahr, which would roughly translate as means the time or Surah Al-Abrar, which Abrar would roughly translate as pious, the pious. And there were a couple of other proposed names of the surah, or at least in circulations, other used ways or other ways of calling the surah and naming the surah. But eventually, a consensus emerged that it be known as Surah Al-Insan. And when you study the way there are proposed names for a surah, and although we don't get very detailed reports about, how a proposal emerges, we can trace it quite often to certain people in certain regions. But we're dealing with very early Islamic history, and when you deal with very early Islamic history, you don't often get a very extensive written record. But it gives you a sense of at least how the early community of Muslims took the essential import of the surah. And I think, in fact, when you consider what the surah is saying, Insan is probably the most appropriate title for the surah. Simply humans. But Grace was mentioning that this is the first Medinan surah, and this is actually another controversial issue. So most authorities say that Surah Al-Insan is Medinan. And the authorities that say that it is Medinan, that it was revealed in Medina, are, most of them are from the second generation of Quranic commentators like Mujahid, Qatada, Al-Hasan al-Basri, Ikramah, and others. But we have a minority view from an earlier generation, mostly, that says that Surah Al-Insan was actually revealed in Mecca. And what is fascinating is that we have a number of reports that say that Surah Al-Insan was revealed directly after Surah Al-Rahman. But if you remember our discussion on Surah Al-Rahman, it is not clear whether Surah Al-Rahman was revealed in Mecca or Medina. While there are many reports that Surah Al-Rahman was revealed in Medina, and most of these reports say that Ar-Rahman was revealed in Medina after the first year in Medina. So there were a number of other surah that was revealed before Ar-Rahman in Medina. Like Al-Baqarah, for instance, was revealed before Ar-Rahman, or at least according to these reports. But at the same time, we get reports that say that in Surah Al-Jinn, when the jinn heard some of the Quran, that they reacted to very strongly, that what they heard was Surah Al-Rahman. And if that report is correct, then that would mean Surah Al-Rahman has to be Meccan and has to be before Surah Al-Jinn. And And so you get this standoff between evidence that would indicate that Surah Al-Rahman is Meccan and evidence that would indicate that Surah Al-Rahman is Medinan. And then you have Surah Al-Insan, which is supposed to be revealed directly after Surah Al-Rahman. But then that means that if Surah Al-Rahman is Meccan, so must be Surah Al-Insan. But if it is Medinan, then so must be Surah Al-Insan. Now, Surah Al-Insan has two contextual hints to it. Is that Surah Al-Insan uses or refers to an asir. And we'll talk about what this word means, but the most plain meaning of the word asir is a captive of war, a prisoner of war. And it's not that it is impossible, but would be unusual for the Quran to mention captives of war in the Mecca period, because Muslims didn't have captives of war. There were no captives. Is it conclusive? No, it's not, because it is possible that the Quran would be referring to captives of war, whether these captives are captured by Muslims or non-Muslims. So when it says be kind to captives of war, it could be stating a general ethical principle that has nothing to do with whether Muslims themselves have prisoners of war or not, but just a broad principle. Nevertheless, many commentators thought that the reference in Surah Al-Insan to prisoners of war or captives of war is evidence that this is a Medinian surah. There are other reports that claim that Surah Al-Insan was revealed in response to an event that took place with the family of the Prophet, especially Ali radiallahu anh and Hassan al-Hussein, the grandchildren of the Prophet. And some of these reports say that when this happened, Hassan al-Hussein were old enough to fast. Well, if that is so, then that would again be further evidence that Surah Al-Insan is from the Medina period and not the Mecca period. That, however, is not conclusive because of the debate around the very narrative that we will talk about involving in Hassan al-Hussein and Surah Al-Insan. So we confront a real challenge in trying to figure out whether Surah Al-Insan is in fact from the Mecca period or the Medina period. If we take the majority of early scholarly sources, then we would conclude it's a surah from the Medina period. If we take the majority of authorities from the first generation of Quranic commentators instead of the second generation, then we would conclude it's a Meccan period surah. If we accept that it was revealed right after Surah Al-Rahman, then we are bound to say if Surah Al-Rahman is Meccan, so is Surah Al-Insan. But if Surah Al-Rahman is Medinian, so is Surah Al-Insan. But is it possible that Surah Al-Insan was not revealed right after Surah Al-Rahman? And yes, it is possible. It is possible that it was not the surah revealed after Surah Al-Rahman, which again complicates the picture even further. When I reviewed my notes last night and reviewed the research that I've done on this now a decade ago, it seemed from my notes that I was, and although my memory is foggy as to precisely the steps I took in researching this issue, but it seemed from my notes at least that I was strongly leaning towards accepting that Surah Al-Insan is Meccan and not Medina. And it's odd to say, but I sort of trust myself a decade ago, because more than I trust myself now, because back then I was in the thicket of all the books. Everything was fresh. I was submerged in all the sources. I was keeping track of all the reports. And so sometimes when you're reading your own notes, you find your own notes cryptic and you can't remember everything. But Allahu A'lam. Now, does it make a difference for the message of the surah? Not really. Except that, considering the message of the surah, you would think that it is so critical that it would come earlier. But on the other hand, the reference to al-asir, to captives, and we'll say more about this because, as we'll see, al-asir doesn't necessarily mean captives of war. But we'll talk about this. It makes you, if it in fact means captives of war, then there's a historical context that sort of makes you uncomfortable conclusively saying that Surah Al-Insan belongs to the Mecca period. So if I would reach a conclusion, I would say in all likelihood, in my opinion, and only Allah knows best, that Surah Al-Insan is Meccan, like Surah Al-Rahman, in my opinion. But I completely accept the possibility that I would be proven wrong by a scholar who's doing extensive research at some later point and reaches a different conclusion. That's the nature of scholarship, is that you always have to present your evidence and accept the possibility that there is something that you've missed, or a lot of things that you've missed. That's just the nature of what research is and scholarship and delving into the past. Okay, when you read a lot of the tafsir on Surah Al-Insan, you get the impression in many of the commentaries that Surah Al-Insan is primarily focused on spelling out what already Surah Al-Rahman has done quite a bit of, and that is spelling out the pleasures of the hereafter, especially heaven, and spelling out the rewards for the Abrar. And we'll talk about the term Abrar. But for now, as a placeholder, let's say the pious. And that, but in fact, Surah Al-Insan In my view, that is not the main objective of Surah Al-Insan. It is not a spelling out of the, the range of rewards and prizes that are waiting the pious. But in fact, it is saying something that weighs very heavily upon the conscience. And it pivots around that key word, Al-Abrar. But in doing so, it puts you fully before the issue of what is the point, what is the meaning of a human being. And a rather sometimes discomforting reflection upon what would be necessary to attain our full humanity and full meaning within our existence. Okay. I'm mostly going to use the tafsir, Muhammad Asad's tafsir, because it's, again, with Surah Al-Insan, it's just far closer to the nuances of the Arabic than any other tafsir I've read. Okay. So let's just start. هل أتى على الإنسان حين من الدهر لم يكن شيئا مذكورا إنا خلقنا الإنسان من نطفة أمشاج نبتليه فجعلناه سميعا بصيرا إنا هديناه السبيل إما شاكرا وإما كفورا. So it begins by posing a rhetorical question. A rhetorical question, the answer to which is rather obvious, but at the same time requires a pause, a reflective pause. You could translate it as, isn't it the case, or has there been, either way would be accurate, but has there been when human beings think of time, and dahr is an unspecified period of time. A dahr is a time in a continuum. When we talk about dahr, we are talking about time without beginning and without end. So a time that is kept track of by a clock would not be called dahr. Dahr is sort of timeless time, if you will. So then you start out with this rhetorical question. Has there not been, in your reflection upon dahr, upon this timeless time, a time when human beings, and here the way it's phrased is, it's the more correct, in my view, translation or interpretation of it would be you as individuals. Some commentators said that it's saying, don't human beings realize that before Adam was created, there were any human beings. But I don't think grammatically that that is the more likely meaning. But rather the more likely meaning is that when you reflect upon time, don't you realize the full connotations, the full meaning of the fact that you are nothing? You were without consciousness. And شيئا مذكورا, that it leaves open the possibility that Allah had foreknowledge of your eventual existence, but it doesn't resolve the issue of Allah's foreknowledge. The way it's phrased, لم يكن شيئا مذكورا, simply says that it's as if saying, reflect upon the fact that the world existed and progressed and functioned without your beingness, and that you come into consciousness to become a madhkur, to become something that is counted, something that is registered or observed or counted. But from nothingness to something. And the way that لم يكن شيئا مذكورا immediately confronts you with, okay, so I have now come to be. Now I have a being, but this beingness, is it contingent on the fact that I matter to, if you will, to observers, or is it not contingent? So if I'm thinking of my beingness, is my beingness in some way either furthered or attained value or worth or truth because I am a madhkur? A madhkur is when you notice something, you observe something, you remember something. And the way it is phrased, it confronts right away with the obvious question: is it because, in our modern language, is it because I have a birth certificate and I have an ID card and I have a name and I have school records and I have official records that matters for my beingness? Or is it because I am in the divine mind, in the mind of God, that makes me a madhkur? So from nothingness to something, and inevitably that being that you enjoy is recognized by your creator, and it is recognized to one extent or another by the created. But it begs the question, where do you end up heading? Where is your landing place? As especially in the Sufi writings, when they comment on Surah Ayatul Dahr, as it's often known, the ayah, the verse known as the verse of Dahr, that if you live your existence and you've worked very hard to be a mazkur, to be remembered by all except God, then you've lost the challenge of Dahr, of timeless time. You've managed to be noticed and remembered by everything, but what really matters when time is no longer subject to the confines of earthly life, when you confront timeless time. Of course, on the other side is that if you are fully aware that your being, your consciousness, what matters is that you are fully in God's eye. Your fame, your worth is defined with your Creator, and that's winning the challenge of timeless time, the challenge of Dahr. Okay. So it starts out, as we said, with this existential, rhetorical question: have you reflected on the fact that you were absolutely nothing, and you came into this consciousness? And have you reflected on the fact that from the time that you come into being, you struggle to be a madhkur? All of us innately want to be recognized and remembered. But have you reflected on the fact, are you keen on being a madhkur, something noted and notable and remembered, with the created or the creator? But upon consciousness, إِنَّا خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ مِنْ نُطْفَةٍ أَمْشَاجٍ نَبْتَلِيهِ فَجَعَلْنَاهُ صَمِيعًا بَصِيرًا. So we've created humans out of a intermingled sperm, or drop of sperm. نَبْتَلِيهِ, so that that human will be tested. Now, this ties into the critical theme of accountability. The word ibtila here is upon consciousness comes the responsibility of accountability. And since you are going to be held accountable, that's the reason for calling life an ibtila. So there is a theological question where they say, is the reason for Allah creating you, is it for Allah to test you? That would not be fully accurate. The test is a consequence of accountability. And that's why many theologians say that it is far more accurate to say that the reason for creation is for you to know your Creator. So that Allah created because the Creator wanted to be recognized and known by what the Creator created. The purpose of your existence is that so you will come to know your Creator. But the possibility of knowing your Creator so that, how do I put this? If Allah created you and defined your will, if Allah created you and said, you have the will that I give you, and per your will, you will come to know me, then this poses a philosophical question. The angels know God, but they know God according to what God pre-decreed about their knowledge of God. So let's say God creates an angel and says, you angel, you will get to know me 70%. The philosophical question is God being known? Because God gave the angel the will through which the angel gets to know God. So effectively, that will can't be attributed to the angel. It must be attributed to God. So it is as if God is knowing God's self. Only with free will is knowledge of God possible. Because God creates you and doesn't define, you will come to know me 70%. God says, I've created you, and the range of possibilities are enormous. You will come to know me 10%, you will come to know me 0%, you will come to know me 100%. It is because of your effort that you come to know God. So then God is coming to be known through the exercise of the autonomous will of a human being. Put it differently, if you create a robot, and let's say that robot is as intelligent as you make it. So the robot only knows about any particular subject, let's say mathematics, what you've programmed into the robot. Is the robot's knowledge attributable to the robot or to you? If the robot has no will of their own, then everything the robot knows is attributable to you. There's no knowledge. It is only if you give the robot the ability to exercise free will in knowing, where you can meaningfully say there is learning and there is knowledge. So this is a more subtle point, because why free will? Well, because without free will, there would be no real knowledge of the divine. then it would just be the divine knowing the self, knowing the divine self, which is entirely circular. But with free will comes the necessity of accountability. And accountability comes the essence of being tested. If I put you in a classroom and I say at the beginning of the classroom, all of you at the end are going to get A's, I might have given you free will, but I've made your presence in the classroom entirely meaningless. If I put you in the classroom and I say by the end all of you will flunk, again, I might have given you free will, but I made your existence of the classroom entirely meaningless because your learning has nothing to do with the consequences. The only way that you're learning, the only way that we can have your learning be commensurate with the consequences of learning is to have justice. To say, well, if you learn XYZ, you pass. If you don't learn, you fail. Whether I treat you justly or not, you have free will. But it is the fact that I make your learning meaningful is what brings in the element, the value of justice. Is this too abstract for people? Okay. So, you often hear carelessly Muslims say, well, the reason for our existence is to be tested. No, the reason for our existence is to know our Creator. Ma'rifatullah. But in order for ma'rifah to have meaning, there must be choice. Otherwise, then God is just knowing God's self. But in order for choice to be meaningful, there has to be a relationship between choice and consequences. That's when accountability comes in. And accountability is what creates the element of ibtila. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنَّ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ مِنْ نُطْفَةٍ أَمْشَاجٍ نَبْتَلِيهِ فَجْعَلْنَاهُ سَمِيعًا بَصِيرًا, then the ibtila is, as I explained, is a consequence of this dynamic that comes along with consciousness. And the Samia, with the power of perception and the power of hearing, some commentators, which I agree with, said that Samia is symbolically stands for revelatory evidence, and Basir stands for aqli evidence, for rational evidence. Basir is insight. And notice it's not وَجْعَلْنَاهُ مُبْصِرًا, it's not that we made him seeing, but we made him have insight. And it was a common in a common symbolism in Arabic language that when you are referring to dalil al-sam'i, i.e. Revelatory evidence that is simply attained through transmission, through memory and transmission, But when you talk about dalil al-aqli, rational evidence, you use the expression basir. And so we've given human beings the ability to consider both types of evidence. Transmitted evidence, i.e. revelation, and rational evidence, i.e. reason. إِنَّا هَدَيْنَاهُ السَّبِيلَ إِمَّا شَاكِرًا وَإِمَّا كَفُورًا. So we've put, and this is you'll find a lot of some tafsirs are closer than others in it, but when Muhammad Asad said, we have shown him the way, and it rests with him to prove himself either grateful or ungrateful. Now you have revelatory evidence and rational evidence. Inna hadaynahu sabil. Some Quran translate this, and we guided human beings to either being grateful or ungrateful. And that translation is clearly incorrect, because the clear meaning of it, Inna hadaynahu sabil, is that we place them on the path of guidance. It's like taking someone and say, okay, this is the path. Now, you can choose to walk this path and ultimately be unrighteous, وَإِمَّا كَفُورٌ, or to be unrighteous. And note that righteousness, because here, as what this alludes to, is the ability to discern right from wrong. But in the Quranic outlook, all rights, all morality begins with the basic moral value of gratitude. And if you go back to the halaqah on Al-Fatiha, the essence of Surah Al-Fatiha is to tell you gratitude. Human beings are notoriously capable of ignoring what they owe, because the idea of gratitude is founded on the philosophy of rights. When I recognize your right, I am being a shakur. When I deny your right, I am being a kafur. Why is that? Because if you are aware of the rights of others, and you are aware that you do not have the right to pounce on the rights of others, that is the heart of the moral value of gratitude. Most of our immorality is because we are confused about what rights we owe others and what rights we feel entitled to unfairly or unjustly. So when I hurt someone, and I hurt someone and I had no right to hurt that person, that dynamic is a dynamic in which rights have stepped over each other. So a right transgressed upon the rights of others. That is the essence of what eats away at a human being, the ingratitude. We don't normally think of rights that way, but that's the essence of rights. Is that when you recognize the right of another, you exist in a relationship of, we say gratitude as a translation for the word shakur, but shakur is not just gratitude, but it is literally the acknowledging the other, acknowledging what the other is due. So of course, the fundamental issue is to acknowledge what is due to your God. Now, we know in Islamic jurisprudence that the presumption is that rights of human beings come before the rights of God in life on earth. So when it comes to figuring out what you should do on earth, you must concern yourself with giving human beings their rights. But in the hereafter, God will vindicate God's rights. And so the challenge is that if you ignore God's rights, there will be a bill to pay. But it's a delayed bill. It's sort of this is part of the magnanimity of God, is that God allows you to get so much credit and doesn't of course that is also the reason why so many people go astray. It's because of that kindness. So let's now go to 4. إن أعتدنا للكافرين سلاسل وأغلالا وسعيرا. For those who are kafirin, and al-kafir is in essence someone who systematically ignores what others are due. So the heart of kufr is ingratitude. And so for those who, so first let's take the translation. Muhammad Asad is translated as we for those who deny the truth, but just put in what we said about kafirin. We've ready chains and shackles and a blazing flame. Now, the aghlal, the salasil and the aghlal and the sa'ir, these 3 elements. Aghlal, salasil are chains. Aghlal are shackles, literal meaning. And sa'ir is hellfire or blazing fire, what? Either. In traditional tafsir, they're given the traditional meaning. But in tafsir like Zamakhshari or Razi or even the Sufi-esque tafsir, the salasil and the aghlal, both the chains and the shackles, are metaphors for the state of human beings who surrendered in their life, those who surrender to their own passions, their own whims, their own false values. And as a result, as you often pointed out in the Sufi tafsir, is that their state in life was a state of enslavement. They lived their lives having been enslaved, having surrendered to what stimulates them, that they've become enslaved to their whims and their passions, and I would simply add to their materialism, to their consuming self. They became enslaved to the zukhruf of the dunya, that they became slave to everything that the world offers consumptively. So their state in the hereafter is but a manifestation of what their hands sowed in the here now. The sa'ir, which in the Sufi tradition, the worst sa'ir, the worst blaze, if you will, is the separation and distance from your maker and your God. The absolute isolation and abandonment and hopelessness and despair, when the only thing that in fact gives you a sense of meaning and purpose in existence, because the only source of meaning in this universe is the divine. Everything else is just a puzzle. You know, vast darkness, vast spaces, means nothing beyond their chemical composition, which is... But the aghlal and the salasil, it's an important concept that these are already shackles, that what one sees in the hereafter is the truth of what they sowed in their earthly life, what they've actually created for themselves. And they've made themselves, or they enslaved themselves in earthly life, and in the hereafter, when the veils are lifted, you see the truth of your being. Okay. إن الأبرار يشربون من كأس كان مزاجها كافورا عينا يشرب بها عباد الله يفجرونها تفجيرا. Okay, so this is now 5 and 6. Whereas the truly virtuous shall drink from a cup flavored, Muhammad Asad says, kylix, of sweet smelling flowers. This is normally translated and I'm not gonna, the study Quran says, truly the pious drink of a cup mixed with camphor. Muhammad Asad says that it's not camphor. If I remember correctly, he argues that no, kafur is not kafur. But anyway, we'll a source of bliss whereof God's servant shall drink, seeing it flow in a flow abundant. Okay. عينا يشرب بها عباد الله يفجرونها تفجيرا. Okay, so now you note here that in verse number 5, Allah right after, so first he posed the existential question of saying, where have you been before consciousness? And your consciousness has a purpose. Your existence has a purpose. And with that purpose comes the ibtila, the challenge, and the challenge of accountability. And that the choice in this path is yours. While those who fail to realize the truth of their existence, that they are limited by the pre-existing rights of their maker and the coexisting rights of the created, the kafirin, who lived enslaved to their passions and their desires and their whims and so they lived an enslavement, a concealed enslavement on earthly life, which becomes an express enslavement in the hereafter. Then that's juxtaposed to Abrar. And that's why I said Surah Al-Insan is a little bit of a challenge. Because it tells you that Al-Abrar, as to the Abrar, they will be drinking a drink that the Quran describes as mizajuha kafur. Now, whether the study Quran is correct in saying it's camphor, or whether Muhammad Asad is correct in saying that it's calyx sweetened with sweetened with or of sweet smelling flowers, it's really beside the point, because mizajuha kafur is at that expression. You can take it literally that you're going to be drink a mixed drink. And normally in the traditional tafsir they tell you it's wine, fragrant wine. But there is a little twist to this, is that Arabs didn't use camphor as a fragrant to wine. And it actually wouldn't work. And that's why Muhammad Asad says calyx, not camphor. But in either case, it's really beside the point, because mizajuha kafur is an expression that has great symbolic significance. When you talked about a drink that was mixed with kafur, it symbolically meant the drink of divine knowledge, the drink of the Godhead, where you attain illumination. It is not an intoxicant. It is not just a thrill drink, but it is the drink of illumination, where the eyes and mind open without barriers. Now, and this is again, I mean, when I realized I'm doing Surah Al-Insan, you always take a deep breath in, because you just pray to Allah, help me communicate everything the way I should communicate it. Those who drink the divine elixir, the elixir of divine knowledge, are lovers of the divine. And lovers of the divine can be of two types. Those who love the divine, lovers of the divine can be of two types. Those who came to know the divine through the attributes of the divine. So those who reflect upon existence and they know the divine through the manifestations of the attributes of divinity in existence. So they see the attributes of Ar-Rahman, the attributes of Ar-Rahim, the attributes of Al-Latif, the attributes of Al-Wadud, all these attributes of divinity. And they come close to Allah through the attributes of divinity. For these people, among the attributes of God is that God is, the attributes of God are complete, a totality that is holistic and balanced. So God is the God of vengeance, but also the God of justice and the God of mercy. And they know God through the attributes of God. Beyond that is when you know God, not through the attributes of God, but through the essence of God. الذات الإلهية. So you got beyond loving God for the attributes of God, but you love God for the essence of God. Bring it closer to you. Do you know when you're in love with someone and they say, why do you love me? Well, I love you because you're kind, you're generous, you're funny, you're... Okay, that's loving someone because of their attributes. They say, why do you love me? I love you because of you. Okay, what if I hit my head and my personality completely changes? I love you so much that it doesn't matter if you become a completely different human being, I still love you. That's loving someone because of their that, of their self. In the discourse about, or in the experience of your relationship with Allah, those who walk the path of love always start with knowing God and experiencing God through the attributes of God. once you elevate beyond, you don't need to be in good health, for instance, to love God. You love God whether you are in pain or in good health, whether you're poor or whether you're rich, whether you're experiencing God's mercy or you're not experiencing God's mercy. It is all the same to you. Your relationship with Allah has become personal and not contingent on the attributes. So, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, those who drink the elixir of divine knowledge, in the especially in the more spiritual writings, that elixir, the way you experience the elixir, depends on what your relationship to Allah is, and whether you know Allah through Allah's attributes or Allah's that. And that is all encapsulated in that short expression, mizajuhu kafura. Okay, now notice that this is what Innal Abrara yashrabun. So who is going to be drinking that elixir? It's the Abrar. And who are the Abrar? And that's the question. And normally we translate the word Abrar as the pious. But Abrar, as linguistically, means something that is wide or expansive or big, spacious. So Al-Abrar is not just those who are pious, but our Abrar are those who have achieved a level of magnanimity. So it is not just the observing Muslim, but it is the Muslim who have gone beyond observance to internalizing either a relationship with the divine attributes, the Sifat al-Ilahiyya, or even more, al-Dhat al-Ilahiyya, the divine self. So one of the most interesting things that I just remember from the tradition, when a student once asked a Maliki scholar, I don't remember what the Maliki scholar's name was. The student asked the Maliki scholar, what does al-Abrar mean? And he said, لا يؤذون الضر. They don't harm, الضر are small insects. He said, they don't harm small insects. It's a remarkable just summation of things. It's like the Abrar are those who've attained a level of awareness of their existence, that their existence, their consciousness, they come from nothingness to something in the dahr. And so does an insect, so does an animal, so does a plant. And so the Abrar are fully aware of their consciousness, and they don't commit acts of kufr. Here, kufr doesn't mean being infidels. Kufr means that they don't transgress upon the rights of those who exist within the dahr. Does everyone follow? So, when they think of themselves and they think of an insect, they don't see themselves as more entitled to be than the insect. We are on equal footing, and the issue is, what rights do I have as a human being and what rights do you have as an insect? And they meticulously maintain the equilibrium of rights. Those are the people that are on the path to understanding the sifat, the attributes, or understanding the that, the self, the divine self, and that become in a position to drink the elixir of divine knowledge. So, Allah then tells us something more about the Abrar. And it is noteworthy what precisely Allah says about the Abrar. So, first, those Abrar, what Muhammad Asad translated, puts as the truly virtuous. So, first, yufuna bin nudhur. They fulfill their vows. وَيَخَافُونَ يَوْمًا كَانَ شَرُّهُ مُسْتَطِيرًا. And they are in awe of a day, the woe of which is bound to spread far and wide. يَوْمًا كَانَ شَرُّهُ مُسْتَطِيرًا. There will be a day which is terrifying, and the Abrar are ever mindful of that day. But note that first, what Allah says about them is they observe the nudhur. Now, nudhur is anything that is promised to another. It could be your word. When you say, I will marry you, that's a nudhur. I will take care of you, that's a nudhur. I will deliver this on time, that's a nudhur. I will do this job, that's a nudhur. But the nudhur are also what is binding upon you by the natural order of things. So when you take care of your child, you are fulfilling a nudhur. Although you might say, I never vowed to take care of my child, and Allah would say, well, when you had the child, that was your vow. Similarly, by the way, which would shock a lot of people among modern Muslims, if you have sexual relations with someone, if Allah allows you to avoid, and let's say you don't live in a state where you can be criminally prosecuted for that, but there's a nudhur in that. You've shared an intimacy, you've shared a privacy, and there are vows, not vows by you, but vows by your maker, that become involved in doing so. Among them, at a minimum, for instance, that if a pregnancy results, that you can't abort it. And you could say, well, I never vowed not to abort. Well, no, you did. When it is God that defines the vows, not you. This is critical, because the way modern Muslims are educated is completely, all this part of our tradition You might have heard that in the old country where your parents came from, that, oh, if someone sleeps with someone, and then if they're discovered, the parents want them to get married. The origin of this, that's a cultural practice, but the theological origin of this is the idea of the implied vows. That's where it came from. Is that, well, now you've done the deed, now you've got to take responsibility for it. Of course, culturally we've emptied it from a lot of its meaning and so on, but when you have to teach our children responsibility of the implied vows of their existence. When you have children, there are implied vows. When you take a job, there are implied vows. When you become a student, there are implied vows. When we live, remember, the kafir is someone who ignores the rights, either the rights of God or the rights of others, both. Yufuna bin nudur, their vows. And that's why the vows, as you notice, come before the fear, or they are in awe of a day that is going to be truly trying. Because the evidence of your fear is your observance of the vows. The evidence that you really do not have fear, that you just tell yourself, I am fearful of the final day, but you lack iman, you don't really believe, is that you don't observe your vows. You think that, oh, it's going to be okay, it's going to be all right. And this is not, remember, we're not talking about just believers, we're talking about the Abrar, because this is really important for the point of the surah. And then beyond that, what does Allah tell us about the Abrar? So we know now the vows, we know now that they are in awe or in fear of the most trying day. But no, this is verse 8 now. وَيُطْعِمُونَ الطَّعَامَ عَلَى حُبِّهِ مِسْكِينًا وَيَتِيمًا وَأَسِيرًا إِنَّا نُطْعِمُكُمْ لِوَجْهِ اللَّهِ لَا نُرِيدُ مِنْكُمْ جَزَاءً وَلَا شَكُورًا إِنَّا نَخَافُ مِنْ رَبِّنَا يَوْمًا عَبُوسًا قَمْطَرِيرًا فَوَقَاهُمُ اللَّهُ شَرَّ ذَلِكَ الْيَوْمِ وَلَقَاهُمْ نُضْرَةً وَسُرُورًا. So those who give food ala hubbihi, regardless, Muhammad Asad says, however great their own want of it. And I'll comment on this. Ala hubbihi. They give food unto the needy, the orphan, and the captive, the asir. Remember, we were talking at the beginning about the asir. Their attitude, what their hearts tell themselves, is we feed you for the sake of God alone. We desire no recompense, no reward from you, nor do we expect gratitude or thanks. Behold, we stand in awe of our sustainer''s judgment on a stressful, fateful day. So we pause here. Those who are abrar observe their vows, but يطعمون الطعام على حبه. Several possible permutations to the meaning of that ayah. They give food although they love meaning they give of the best of what they owe. Ala hubbi, although they love what they have. So in other words, although they want to hold on to what they have, but they give it. And they give it to the needy, they give it to the orphan, and they give it to the captive. Okay. Another permutation. Ala hubbihi doesn't really mean that it's just dear to them or what they really value. So they give what they value the most. But even if they have a great need for it, they still share it. Many Sufi tafsir said, ala hubbihi doesn't refer to the food, it refers to we give food ala hubbihi, mean out of our love for God. I think that tafsir is incorrect. I don't think ala hubbihi means out of our love for God, because it says that in the next ayah. But I think ala hubbihi actually means it's not talking about just food. It's talking about your attitude towards material things that you value. We share what we have, although we care. I don't give you what I don't use. I don't give you what is extra. I don't give you what is I'm done with. I give you from the heart of what I desire and want, and I'm actually attached to. Now, so when you translate this, what is it? It's your attitude towards material things. It's exactly what we were saying at the beginning. If you are a materialistic human being, and you say, my car, my clothes, my money, my house, you're not among the Abrar. The Abrar are these class of people who understood the balance between rights after coming to consciousness, and understand that the heart of morality is a gratitude among the complex matrix of rights, and that if you understand the complex matrix of rights, then you're hard-pressed to answer the following question, as the Qadi Abdul-Jabbar says. Why am I entitled to eat and survive, but you are not entitled to eat to survive? You don't know between me and you which of us is a better human being. You don't know between me and you which of us is closer to Allah. You don't know which of us has a pure heart. We don't know, and we shouldn't know. That's not the issue. The issue is that we instinctively think that I have a right to preserve myself, and if I have extra, I'll preserve you. But that's not the moral question. The moral question is, why do I have a right to preserve yourself and you don't? And what makes my life more valuable than yours? And if Qadi Abdul-Jabbar said, if you pose that question as a moral compass, and you ask, what gives me the right to be wearing these fine threads while you go around and torn in rags? What gives me the right to sleep comfortably while you in a bed, while you sleep in the street? The way you conceive of the complex relationship between rights will be altered completely. because we have no philosophical way other than pure instinctive selfishness to say, well, I have value or I have a greater right, because if you say, well, it's my labor, but then you confront the issue of, well, is it really your labor or is it the labor that Allah gave to you? Now, of course, here again, we go back to the Abrar, There is a couple of other things about this. There is a narrative widely reported that is often said to be the reason that these ayat were revealed. And the narrative is the following, is that Imam Ali and Fatima had their children, Al-Hasan wal-Hussein, and Al-Hasan wal-Hussein became ill during a plague. And that they were very sick, and that Imam Ali and Fatima prayed to Allah to cure them, and they vowed that if they are cured, they'll fast 3 days. And so Allah cured Al-Hasan al-Hussein. And then Imam Ali and Fatima didn't have food at home. So they went and they borrowed some wheat from a neighbor. In some reports it says a Jewish neighbor. And Fatima radiallahu anha baked pieces of bread, a piece of bread for each member of the family. So the first day, as they were getting ready to eat, a man came and said, I am very poor. Do you have anything that you can give me? So they gave him the food that they had prepared. And on the second day, another person came, and this person was an orphan. And so they gave him, the second day, also gave him whatever food they had, and they went hungry. And on the third day, they gave the food to someone who was a captive of war. Hence, when I say that if this is an occasion for revelation, then this has to be a Medinan surah, not a Meccan surah. Because it was supposed to be a captive of war who is not a believer, who is an infidel, who is a kafir, but who was captured in the water, a battle of Badr. And the way prisoners of war was treated at the time of the Prophet ﷺ was that prisoners of war would be distributed among the different houses in Medina. So the Prophet ﷺ would say, you know, okay, you go to this house, you go to this house, you go to that house. And it was then up to the house that is sheltering the prisoner of war to feed that prisoner of war. But the Prophet ﷺ said that you must feed them like you feed yourselves. Okay. So, according to the narrative, is that then the third day is the prisoners' war. Then, after 3 days of not eating, because every day they've given their food away, the Prophet ﷺ saw Imam Ali and Fatima and Hassan al-Hussein, and they looked weak and pale because from malnutrition, because they hadn't eaten for 3 days. And Surah Al-Insan then was revealed at that point. Now, there is a big debate about the authenticity of this tradition. in terms of chains of transmission, it enjoys solid chains of transmission. The skepticism about this tradition, some of the skepticism is because of certain involvement of certain people in the chain of transmission, but if we overlook that, because if you believe that these people are okay, which I believe they're okay, then then the chain of transmission is solid. But the issue is that it was not in keeping with the character of Imam Ali radiallahu anh on Fatima al-Zahra to say that Allah, if you or our children will fast 3 days. That type of vow is not, it's very inconsistent with their personality. So that's one. Two, it has the earmark of medieval narratives that are very structured and layered. On the first day there's a needy person, on the second day there's an orphan, on the third day there's a captive of war. Very sifted and organized, and that's very typical of medieval narratives. It is very likely, and I think we have ample evidence of that, is that simply what happened is that probably they did go and borrow wheat. Fatima Zahra probably baked bread, a piece of bread, a loaf of bread for each, which is like a circle, it was a bun. A bread for Imam Ali, one for Hassan, one for Hussein. And probably a poor person did come by and they gave them the food. And I think that probably is a historical event. But I think the historical event was then remembered and exaggerated into 3 days with a needy person, an orphan, and a captive. And then it was grafted as an occasion for revelation for Surah Al-Insan. But there are many reports about the practice of Ahlul Bayt, of people knowing that if there's any food to give, they will give it, even if they go hungry. And that's too cumulative, and even to the point of tawatur. There's so many reports of such events. And there were so many people around Medina who were needy, because a lot of people who were converting to Islam were very poor. And people who were runaway slaves, people who were runaway farmers, people who were runaway laborers, running away from persecution, who were absolutely destitute, and they knew that going to Ahlul Bayt is the best bet they have. And it became very well known that Ahlul Bayt would give whatever clothes they have, whatever food they have, whatever anything they have. So that is beyond doubt. But what I'm talking about is that highly structured narrative and grafting it upon Surah Al-Insan. Okay. Now, the other thing, last point for prayers. The other thing is about the word asir. Asir could mean, and in most situations it means a war captive, a prisoner of war. However, the Prophet ﷺ said, غريمك أسيرك فاحسن إلى أسيرك. Anyone who owes you money is your asir, is your captive. So the Prophet ﷺ said, so be kind and generous to your captive. we have from the Sunnah of the Prophet that the Prophet ﷺ not just referred to someone that owes you money as your captive, but anything or anyone who needs you as your asir. So we have in the tradition that a cat that depends on you to eat is your asir. So a dog who relies on you for their survival is your asir, which means that you are obligated to preserve its life and to take care of it. Al-Abrar do not put their life ahead of the life of their asir, including whatever relies on them for its sustenance. They do not believe themselves entitled over others, but they see everything from the perspective of a matrix and balance of rights. And they're ever so careful not to transgress upon the rights of others. Okay, let's stop here and pray Asr. We'll be back inshallah. You know, I have to say this, Surah Al-Insan, no Muslim who is worth being called a Muslim can afford not to learn what Surah Al-Insan is saying. Surah Al-Insan, I mean, I've heard many Muslims give tafsir of Surah Al-Insan, and they all made me want to cry. It's just completely superficial, completely ignorant, completely unlearned, without learning, without, you know. But I can't help but feel sad that, you know, we're such a small group for such a monumental message. لله الأمر من قبل ومن بعد. As we were saying, so the vows, the relationship to material things, and the special status of the needy, orphans, and the asir. And as we said, the asir could be a war captive, but also could be a person in debt, or any person that, or anything that relies on you for its sustenance. And asir also could be people in prison, generally. In Surah Al-Imran, Allah says, وَلَن تَنَالُوا الْبِرَّ حَتَّى تُنْفِقُوا مِمَّا تُحِبُّونَ, that you will not attain bir, abrar, the same word, that status, unless you spend of what you are attached to, what you care about. So again, that same idea that it is not simply a matter of spending, that not matter of just spending of what is excess, or what giving what is extra, or what is beyond what you need. And that verse 9, that we give you, we feed you, not expecting anything in return, not even gratitude. Now, if you notice that one of the biggest problems with the ethic of giving is that wealthy people will often give but want a differential attitude. They want to be the fact that they give affects the relationship of power vis-a-vis others. So the fact that they give makes them feel that you should speak to them with a certain amount of deference, that you should acknowledge their authority, acknowledge their position, which is, it's good for whatever it's worth, but it is not the status of the Abrar. It is the Abrar, they're giving, they do it out of a sense of what they owe people, meaning the rights of others. And they do not, in fact, even expect gratitude or any type of return for it. And when you say لِوَجْهِ اللَّهِ, that we give you that expression for لِوَجْهِ اللَّهِ, literally for God's face, but لِوَجْهِ اللَّهِ, which is an idiomatic expression, means for God's sake. But it is because of our relationship to God. لِوَجْهِ اللَّهِ means because of our relationship to God, because of what we believe we are bound to do, because of how we understand our relationship with God, we are giving. There is one final thing about this. There is a report about Aisha, the Prophet's wife, that when she would send people things, she would give people things, she would ask what did they say when they received whatever she was sending them. And they would say, well, they did, when they received it, they said, may Allah reward you, may Allah bless you, all the dua. And then she would repeat the precise dua that they said on her behalf back at them. So she would say, may Allah bless them, may Allah reward them. And that she would do so precisely to fight the temptation that she would be among those who expect to be thanked or expect anything in return for giving. Okay. فوقاهم الله شر ذلك اليوم ولقاهم نضرة وسرورا. So Allah then protects the Abrar of the woes of that day and bestows upon them, the Abrar, Nadratan. Nadra is an illuminosity, a brightness, a glow, wasurura, and happiness. Now note that this day, which is described as a day of Qamtarir, Abus, a very difficult day, a trying day. The attitude of the Abrar is not just that they are rewarded, but they are, the blessing that they are given is that they know that they are secure. So in that day, when everyone else is sweating buckets, in intense anxiety, in worry, the attitude of the Abrar is that they will have nadra, a level of tranquility and comfort and peace, wasurura, and even happiness. وَجَزَاهُمْ بِمَا صَبَرُوا جَنَّةً وَحَرِيرًا. And Allah gives them بِمَا صَبَرُوا. And notice, as this is again something that many theologians have noted, that Allah immediately goes to the issue of perseverance and patience. Because you cannot be among the Abrar, those who are mindful, ever mindful of gratitude, i.e., the rights of others, including the rights of God, of course. And you cannot be among those who fight off attachment to material things and not find that trying and difficult in your life on earth. And so Allah goes directly to the heart of the matter and says, for their patience, they are then rewarded with Jannah. وحريرة, Harir literally is silk, and normally in most traditional tafsir they're translated as garments of silk. But Harir doesn't need to be translated as silk. Harir is any state. The reason we call silk is because it induces Harir, i.e. it induces, or it's supposed to induce, or was thought to induce, a state of intense repose and comfort. So when you say that their reward is Jannah and Harir, means their reward is Jannah and peace and comfort, not their reward is Jannah and silk garments. Okay. متكئين على الأرائك لا يرون فيها شمسا ولا زمهريرا ودانية عليهم ظلالها وذللت قطوفها تذليلا ويطاف عليهم بآنية من فضة وأكواب كانت قوارير من فضة قدروها تقديرا ويسقون فيها كأسا كان مزاجها زنجبيلا عينا فيها تسمى سلسبيلا. Okay, so this now takes us to verse 18. So Muhammad Asad's translation, which I'll rely on for that they in that garden they will be crouching, or they will be reclining on crouches, and will know therein neither burning sun nor cold severe, since its blissful shades will come down low over them, and will hang down its clusters of fruit most easy to reach. And they will be waited upon with vessels of silver and goblets that will seem to be crystal-like and of silver. The measure thereof they alone will determine. And in that paradise they will be given to drink of a cup flavored with ginger, derived from a source to be found therein, whose name is Seek Thy Way. عينا تسمى فيها سلسبيلا. Now, the first thing you notice about this description in Surah Al-Insan is that it makes reference to things that seem familiar and common, but if you reflect and you pay attention to what it's saying, it also, at the same time, is nothing like what we know on earth. So, first, متكئين فيها على الأرائك. Okay, so they're reclining. And we know that reclining was, as an image, intimately connected with the issue of class in this time. Rich people ate while reclining. People who were not rich did not eat while reclining. It was part of the mannerisms of the rich, is that they eat reclining. لا يرون فيها شمسا ولا زمهريرا. So they do not experience in it. Shams is sun, Zamharir is cold. ودانية عليهم ظلالها وذللت قطوفها تذليلا. At the same time that there is no sun and there is no cold, but there are shades, وَذُلِّلَتْ عَلَيْهِمْ ظِلَالُهَا, that they are in shades. Muhammad Asad puts in brackets blissful shades, and I suspect that the reason he put blissful shades is because of the same issue that I will talk about, is that that shade is normally because of the interaction between sunlight and what blocks sunlight. And the reason we care about shade is because of the properties of the sun and the heat that comes from the sun. But here, the Quran first tells you that there is no sun and there is no cold. But then it comes and tells you that they are in shades. And it tells you وَذُلِّلَتْ قُطُوفُهَا, that something is hanging in low clusters that is easy to access, but it doesn't say what is hanging in low clusters. And when you say that أكواب كانت قوارير, meaning these are cups that are transparent because they're made of very fine glass. But here, the Quran gives you a twist, and it tells you that these very fine cups are not made of glass, they're made of fidda, made of silver. We don't know how to make out of silver something that looks like fine transparent glass. And it emphasizes this, قواريرا من فضة قدروها تقديرا. So these cups of translucent silver, they are measured proportionately to each person according to something that this person exercises, but we don't know what is it that the person exercises. So the way this is resolved in traditional tafsir is to say that, well, you will drink as much as you want to drink at will. So you have the cups, your cups will be full of wine, and they will be as full as you want them to be full. And what you drink is flavored with ginger, which ginger and wine were not things flavored together among Arabs at that time. I don't know if ginger and wine are flavored together now, but okay. And this spring, there is a spring that is known as Salsabil, but the word Salsabil itself gives pause because The word salsabil is a composite word which means sal ayna sabil. Ask, what is the path? In response to earlier generations reflecting upon these verses, Ibn Abbas says, وَكُلُّ مَا ذَكَرَهُ اللَّهُ فِي القُّرْآنِ مِمَّا فِي الجَّنَّةِ فَلَيْسَ مِنْهُ فِي الدُّنْيَا إِلَّا الْإِسْمِ. That everything that Allah mentions in Jannah, the only commonality between it and what we know on earth is the name. So what Ibn Abbas is saying is that a kas in earthly life means a cup. But what is a cup in the hereafter, we have no clue. Or when Allah says ara'ik, couches, on earth we know what couches are, but what are couches in the hereafter, we have no clue. Now, beyond that, some of the, and I'm taking you just step by step, so just bear with me. Other theologians then commented that you note that in earthly life, joys, لذات الدنيوية محصورة في ثلاث أمور. Earthly pleasures tend to pivot around three things. قضاء الشهوة, the pleasure of shahwa, like shahwa is like food or sex. It's something that you do physically and it brings you pleasure. وإمضاء الغضب, and the discharge of accumulated energy or angst. واللذة الخيالية التي يعبر عنها بحب المال والجاه, and a love of an aspirational pleasure like power, prestige, money. So it is, you are discharging a material pleasure like eating, sex, discharging energy like anger or angst or whatever bubbles within the self. And third is an aspirational, relational pleasure like money, power, prestige. And I believe this is from Al-Razi, but I might be wrong. And then typically the comment on this is وَمَا ذَكَرَهُ اللَّهُ فِي الجنة يجب أن يكون مغايرا لتلك اللذات الحقيرة. But what Allah mentions in the context of heaven is not consistent with any of these pleasures. This is a coup, because if you are not relying on shahwa and you're not relying on bent up energy like anger or ambition, and you're not relying on a conceived relational pleasure like power or money, then the very nature of the things that you enjoy in heaven are very different than what we commonly understand by pleasures. So, this is precisely then the people. Then you come and say, well, what are the pleasures? The rationalists and the Sufis are surprisingly very close in the way that they understand the ayat of Surah Al-Insan, and that what these descriptions are not of any pleasures that we have a frame of reference to, but both the rationalists and the Sufis see all these pleasures as a stages of illumination and knowledge and enlightenment. So, متكئين على الأرائك, reclining on couches, they read that as you recline on the foundation of knowledge that you had attained in your earthly life. لا شمسا ولا زمهريرا, that there is no shame. It's not you're not tormented. There's no any of the lowly inclinations or lowly feelings. But you are in dhilal, meaning you are in safety and security. وَذُلِّلَتْ قُطُوفُهَا تَذْلِيلًا. But what is available to you are the perils of illumination and knowledge and closeness to the divine, that as if hanging fruit, that all depend on your will to walk the path. And they have a very similar interpretation about the qawarir min fidda and so on. All of the words stand symbolically for attainments of illumination and self-realization. And here, so they make a considerable deal out of why Allah said that the qawarir are from fidda and not from gold. Because fidda had, in the idiomatically, a significant symbolic meaning, silver in particular, as to this, while gold connoted vanity and flashiness, silver connoted the opposite of vanity, but rather meaning and substance. So you are, what you're imbuing, what you're taking in, are state or are points of illumination and knowledge that represent stages or points of proximity to the divine. So notice then in 20 we come to what we've encountered before. وَيَطُوفُ عَلَيْهِمْ وِلْدَانٌ مُخَلَّدُونَ إِذَا رَأَيْتَهُمْ حَسِبْتَهُمْ لُؤْلُؤًا مَنْثُورًا وَإِذَا رَأَيْتَ ثُمَّ رَأَيْتَ نَعِيمًا وَمُلْكًا كَبِيرًا. So an immortal youth will wait upon them. When thou seest them, thou wouldst deem them to be scattered pearls. And when thou seest anything that is there, thou will see only bliss and a realm transcendent. Before actually doing this, I wanted to on the ayat that in the ayat that where Allah is talking about the crouches and the goblets and so on. So this is from Ibn Ajiba. He says, and then I'll pray for it. ويطعمون طعام الأرواح والأسرار من العلوم والمعارف على حبه إذ لا شيء أعز منه عندهم إذ هو الإكسير الأكبر والغنى الأوفر مسكينا أي ضعيفا من اليقين ويتيما لا شيء and so on. And then he also says يطهرهم من محبة الأغيار ويقول من الغل والغش والدعوة من سقاه اليوم شراب محبته لا يستوحش في وقته من شيء ومن مقتضى شربه بكأس محبته أن يجود على كل أحد بكونين من غير تمييز لا يبقى على قلبه أثر للأخطار وما آثر شربه بذل كله لكل أحد لأجل محبوبه and so on. So in the Sufi-esque tradition, what he's saying is pretty much what I introduced, that what they're consuming and what they're drinking, what they're taking in, is asrar min al-ulum wal-ma'arif ala hubbih, or the knowledge of the knowledge of the path of loving Allah and being in a loving relationship with Allah. Where you say that they are cleansed of, in that state, they are cleansed of all desires, but their single genuine desire to know their divine maker and the truth of the divine maker. So this we've encountered, of course, before, but it's important to keep remembering that the traditional stance, which sees the pleasures of heaven in very material terms, is not the only stance. Okay, we'll go back to verse 20 about the immortal youth. Okay. This in traditional tafsir is described as immortal youth, meaning beautiful young souls that serve people in Jannah. Who are these youth? In traditional tafsir, you get the rather ridiculous opinion that these are the children of kuffar. Second school says that these are the children of believers who died at a very young age, and they died before the age of accountability, so they all automatically went to Jannah. The third view that says, no, these are not children of kuffar or children of believers. These are beings who are created by God in the hereafter in Jannah to serve those in Jannah. These are the traditional positions. What represents, and again we've encountered this before, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but is the Sufi-esque tradition, which all goes back to these youth that appear as immortal youth, or tajalliyat ذاتية مقرطون بقرطة الأسماء والصفات إذا رأيتهم حسبتهم اللؤلؤ منثور من تشعشع أنوار الذات وتلألؤ أنوار الصفات والأسماء. That these are but reflections of the self. As we said before, you see yourself minus all the corrupting accumulations, that it is seeing the self in its real potential. And that self then becomes a critical partner in the path towards illumination and proximity to the divine. So you encounter the best version, if you will, of yourself. That best version, you will see the potential that you never realized on earth. But it is your dynamic with that self that then will propel you to proximity of the divine. And that's why in Sufi-esque tafsir, they even say the wildan are genderless. That these youth are neither male or female. They are you, but without gender. Okay. And they often pause at precisely this is expression, وَإِذَا رَأَيْتَ ثُمَّ رَأَيْتَ نَعِيمًا وَمُلْكًا كَبِيرًا. That then if you look what you will really see is Mulkan Kabir. I like the way Muhammad Asad translates it as transcendent realm. It's as if saying there is no frame of reference other than to say that the place you will be in is a transcendent realm. In a transcendent realm, as the Sufi-esque tradition maintains, it is inconceivable that in the transcendent realm that what you will be engaged in is sex and food and wine. Okay. And then وإذا رأيت عليهم ثياب سندس خضر واستبرق وحلو وأساور من فضة وسقاهم ربهم شرابا طهورا إن هذا كان لكم جزاء وكان سعيكم مشكورا. Okay. So, and those blessed will be garments of green, silk, and brocade. Garments of green has, again, enormous symbolic value in Old Arabic. Garments in green and silk is a purified, special, enlightened state. So even in pre-Islamic poetry, when they would say someone wore garments in green and silk, they didn't actually mean that they were wearing green textile, as some modern Arabs think it is, because they read this stuff and they think that they were actually wearing green. What they're saying is that the status of their clothes was a status of a pure person or a truly noble person. Okay. And the other thing is وَسَقَاهُمْ رَبُّهُمْ شَرَابًا طَهُورًا, and that Allah, and for in the Sufi tradition, they pause at this at great length, that it is Allah that gives them a purifying drink. Either you take this literally, that Allah will be actually giving them a drink that purifies them, which would difficult to imagine what it would mean, or that the purifying drink is due, or what purifies them, the flow, and in fact they use something very close to what we mean by energy, the flowing power that goes through them, that purifies them of all but the desire to know Allah, is due to a direct relationship with Allah. And that's what Allah, now this, I'll tie this at the end to the whole purpose of the surah. Okay. So then we reach this point. Now notice that Surah Al-Insan doesn't dwell upon the punishments of hell, and that Surah Al-Insan talks about the Abrar and then speaks in symbolic language about what will take place with the Abrar, but it culminates in that Allah quenches them, satisfies them with a purifying drink, or a flow of purification. And the eye of that purification goes back to this ayn, this eye, this spring, known as Salsabil. And as it's a composite word, as Imam Ali said, which means Sal Ayn Sabil. If a non-literal translation would be, set your gaze upon the path. Then it says, then it takes you back. إِنَّا نَحْنُ نَزَّلْنَا عَلَيْكَ الْقُرْآنَ تَنزِيلًا. Now it's speaking again to the Prophet and through the Prophet ﷺ to us. We've sent the Quran to you. Tanzila means in stages or in segments, not all at once. So we've sent you the Quran. So what? فاصبر لحكم ربك ولا تطع منهم آثما أو كفورا. So persevere. Persevere, hold fast to لحكم ربك, the judgment of your Lord. But here the judgment means to the will of your Lord, to the life that you're in and everything that transpires in this life. And do not follow either an atham is someone who is not, and it didn't say, notice, kafir, it said kafura. An atham, someone who is a sinner, someone who might know what's right, is not that they are in a state of constant ingratitude by denying the rights, but someone who sins, weak, or someone who is kafur, someone who is in fact in this relationship of ingratitude. وَلَا تُطِعْ is so broad that don't be influenced by people who are either an atheist, someone who constantly errs, or kafur, someone who doesn't understand gratitude. But it doesn't stop there. It says, وَاذْكُرْ اسم ربك بكرة وأصيلا ومن الليل فاسجد له وسبحه ليلا طويلا. So constantly be in remembrance of the name of your Lord. Bukratan wa asila, in the morning and evening, and at night prostrate yourself before your Lord. وَسَبِّحْهُ لَيْلًا طَوِيلًا, and be in a state of dhikr and tasbih, glorifying your Lord throughout the long night. The tenor, the tone of these verses is consoling someone in hardship. So as you in fact come into contact with and interact with the athim and the kafur, and the athim and the kafur, those who are in error and those who do not understand gratitude and are not grateful, will always seek to influence you, to lead you astray. Your attitude is to persevere, to be patient, to hold steadfast, and your salvation is constant remembrance and constant dhikr. And note, which is a demanding standard, right? Because it is morning, evening, and sujood, and staying up laylan tawila, staying up late at night. And then the comment, إن هؤلاء يحبون العاجلة ويذرون وراءهم يوما ثقيلا. Because understand that the problem with these people who you find so trying the problem with them is that they are so attached to the fleeting life in which they live, and they are not mindful of the very serious, heavy, and grief-laden day that awaits them. That day is coming, but so many are just preoccupied with their life. They're in a different universe than yours. نحن خلقناهم وشددنا أسرهم وإذا شئنا بدلنا أمثالهم تبديلا إن هذه تذكرة فمن شاء اتخذ إلى ربه سبيلا. And the comment to this is that, remember, we've created them, we strengthened them. In other words, we've given them the energy, the power, the health to do what they're doing. And if we would have willed, none of them would exist. And none of them would be bothering you. And this is but a reminder so that whomever wants to can take the path to their Lord. And remember, وَمَا تَشَاءُونَ إِلَّا أَن يَشَاءَ اللَّهُ إِنَّ اللَّهَ كَانَ عَلِيمًا حَكِيمًا. that remember that none of them would be capable of doing anything they do if it hadn't been for the fact that Allah allows them to do it. You know, this is, again, the coming in and that psychology that might be tempted to say, well, these people are so disgusting, they don't have the right to do it, so I'm going to eradicate them. Or it is my job to wipe them out. Repeatedly, the Quran comes and time again and says, that's not your business. Yeah, they might be athim, they might be kafur, they might be, in fact, as far removed as you can possibly be from the Abrar. Because the Abrar have been pictured or have been set at a demanding stage, a demanding level. How many of us are among the Abrar? But Allah comes and tells the Prophet and his followers, it is not up to you. Remember that this is but a reminder for whoever wants to take, and it's an individual choice, wants to take the path. يدخل من يشاء في رحمته والظالمين أعد لهم عذابا أليما. Because Allah admits in Allah's grace whomever Allah wills. But for the zalimeen, the unjust, their accountability is going to be grievous suffering. So we go back and say this is Surah Al-Insan. A deep reflection on, if you ask what is expected of a human being, and what is expected of a human being is an ideal. The ideal is to be among the Abrar. Now, to be among the Abrar, you must be someone who understands gratitude, the rights of others, including God, your Maker, someone who respects their vows, and someone who doesn't put himself or herself ahead of others, especially when it comes to the needy, the orphan. And what is the orphan? It's not the fact that it's not the technical definition of an orphan. An orphan is someone who doesn't have caretakers. They don't have caretakers. You have to take care of them. And the asir. And as we said, the asir is not just the captive of war, but the captive of debt. Someone who works for you, a servant, for instance, is your asir. Someone who is in prison is an asir. An asir is what we in our modern language call a disempowered human being. And you understand that it is your obligation to go beyond yourself and rid yourself of your material attachments to come to the aid. Now, if you rise to that level, let's strike that. Allah understands that that's demanding. So, the ideal prototype is, Allah knows you will be challenged. you will be tempted. You will be resisted. Who is going to resist you? Who's going to tempt you? Who's going to challenge you? It is the athim, those people who sin and they love the company of sinning. People who sin and they think that someone like you is naive and idiotic and stupid. Because after all, you give away your best stuff. You don't put yourself ahead of others. What type of intelligent, savvy human being is that? That's a loser. And the kafur. What is the medicine? How do you handle that? Perseverance and patience. But then, to cling to Allah, that Allah's name is constantly within you, morning and night, and in fact you persevere, you exert yourself beyond your comfort zone. Notice the theme here is it's all for the Abrar, is beyond their comfort zone. Because you have to stay up late at night, not watching Netflix, but doing dhikr. Beyond the comfort zone. For those people, ultimately, they deserve the status they attain is as if Allah directly quenches their thirst. They've already rid themselves of the attachments of material things, so they are already close to Allah and deserve a special treatment and a special status with Allah. So when someone says, what is the purpose of our existence? And you say the purpose of our existence is to be among the Abrar. How many of us will fulfill the purpose of our existence? Very few. But that doesn't matter. What matters is how close you get. Between a kafur, someone who just is a horrible, ungrateful human being who destroys the rights of all people, steals everyone's rights, a completely egocentric human being. Between that and the Abrar is a long distance. The wise human being wants to fall as close to the earmark of the Abrar as possible. But the point of life is not simple obedience, technical rituality, so that you barely make it to heaven, even if it's just by a point. The point of life is the higher attainment. So when I'm teaching my child, I don't teach my child, do the minimum. I teach my child there are ideals. And the ideals matter. And even if we cannot attain the ideals, we must always aspire for the ideals. Even if we cannot achieve a society that feeds the needy, that takes care of the orphan, that liberates the disempowered, then at a minimum, we must try as hard as we can. So when we meet Allah, we say, Allah, you know I wasn't among the Abrar, but you also know I've tried my best. And that's why this surah is known as Surah Al-Insan. Now, the Prophet ﷺ is reported to, this is yet again one of the surah that the Prophet would make a point to recite every day, and there are many reports that you would recite it, especially at Fajr. And there are tons of traditions about various companions or successors of Tabi'een that talk about the blessings of Surah Al-Insan, and you can read endless stories about the Sufi master who would recite Surah Al-Insan 500 times a day, and the illuminations and enlightenments, and how they came, they got closer to Allah, and they reached an elevated road. So Surah Al-Insan, from the time of revelation, throughout Islamic history, was recognized as one commentator put it, among a central jewel of the Quran, min la'ali al-Quran, one of the perils of the, that it cannot be taught as separate ayat. It must be taught as a philosophy, as a Quranic philosophy to us human beings. Before I stop, let me just make sure I didn't forget anything. About the tasbih, وَسَبِّحُوا لَيْلًا طَوِيلًا. Remember that Allah says to the Prophet ﷺ in Surah Al-Hijr, وَلَنَعْلَمُ أَنَّهُ يَضِيقُ صَدْرُكَ بِمَا يَقُولُونَ فَسَبِّحُوا لَيْلًا طَوِيلًا. Allah knows that it weighs heavily on your heart what these people say. So what is the answer? فَسَبِّحْ, tasbih, long into the night. Okay. And that's it for Surah Al-Insan. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.
Thank you so much. This, I feel like this surah is just, from beginning to end, was just so viscerally impactful. Like sometimes, I've said that, like we get to a point and I feel it, at a certain point, I feel like this whole surah, it was so long, but so rich and heavy and powerful, that it's just mind-blowing. And it's like leaves you speechless. So I think we need a moment to kind of collect our thoughts, maybe pray Maghrib, and then go ahead and send your questions through. Thank you so much. This I feel, like this surah just captures it all. It's like, it's hard to imagine now knowing what it has and how you understood it, how it could not be but a Meccan surah, because it just feels so foundational, so basic, but so rich with the core of the faith. And so thank you so much. I mean, it's hard to imagine that, when you say that you're hearing other tafsir, and that it's sad that they don't reach this. I mean, even when you just look at the English translation and compare that to what we just learned, it's such a gap. So I feel so grateful that we received it today here. Thank you. So. Okay, we'll take a break, pray Maghrib, and be back, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum, bismillahir-rahmanir-rahim. Again, I just want to express just intense gratitude, because this surah, I just feel was so powerful and rich. And I was thinking, actually, at the break, that, I'm very mindful about when we, in my mind, receive sort of these chapters again. It's kind of like revelations anew for a different time and age, because it's like we're the only ones that are really going back and studying every single chapter and the meaning. And so when we receive this one, 65 surahs in, as opposed to, at the beginning, like I actually was thinking that now, with the familiarity that we've developed, I think hearing it again is actually really powerful, because I know at one time in a different surah, you also had said the purpose of creation, the purpose of life is, but it was a different answer. It was something like what you do, or it's the test, or it's the, someone had responded that it was a little bit anticlimactic. But in this sense, when you say the purpose of creation or the purpose of life is to be an Abrar, that actually, now having gone through 64 previous surahs, holds a much richer meaning than if we had received it earlier on. And obviously a lot of the things that we're taught now, we've heard many times before, but it feels different now. So then in that sense, going back to, I remember in a previous halakha you had also said, it's possible, there's a disagreement about something coming in and believed to be a Meccan surah as opposed to Medinan surah, but it's possible that it was such an important message that it was both. And I'm wondering if maybe that's, not that it's important, but just the idea that I feel like that understanding of the purpose of creation, and it was stated so clearly, and even the way that you talked about the philosophy of in order to know God, then also ties in the whole issue of free will and accountability and justice. Like all of that became so crystal clear as we covered it in this surah now, and it built upon the understanding that we developed in previous surahs. So I mean, just to say, even though this was so powerful, I think it meant so much more receiving it after all of the other things we've received previously. So that struck me as I was thinking about it. Is there a dhikr for this, or is the whole surah dhikr?
No, it's verse 8 and 9.
Verse 8 and 9?
Yeah.
So thank you again. This was really stunning, and I think just takes us to another place. And the power of being able to encapsulate it in a concept is much more powerful, I think, now, after some time of being more familiar with other surahs. So, Parveen, did you want to start us off?
Thank you. Well, thank you so much. And once again, you outdid yourself with the tafsir. It's amazing. Years ago, I read, I have a comment and then a question. Years ago, I read something by Dr. Ali Shariati that described the human being. In Farsi, both Adam and Insan are translated as human being. Mm. And the way he put it very eloquently, he said that Adam is the being, Budan, and then Insan is the Shodan, is the becoming. And it was amazing how you went through the step-by-step of how we as human can become, as opposed to just be an Adam, just a being. Thank you so much for all the knowledge that you generously share with us here. My question is on the issue of Nazr and what you had alluded to, the hadith of Imam Ali alayhi salam, that naturally it's very unbecoming of him making a transaction as such. I realize that too. But I'm wondering if that actually probably has any hold on, the Ahl Tashayyu having such a strong affection with this notion of Nazr. And what are your thoughts, and are they really effective, do you think?
First, just to make sure that everyone heard this, that Ali Shariati his distinction that Adam is the being, just the physical being in existence. And the insan is the becoming of what the potential of the being is. And Ali Shariati's thought, a lot of his thought was so Quranically permeated. It emerged from the heart of the Quran, and it's a lot of a lot of it dovetails with the it's you attain consciousness, but to be an insan, it is beyond consciousness. It is where it is very much like in the Western tradition where we say to attain your humanist potential. But of course, here in the Quran, it is such an eloquent statement of anything beyond anything that we encounter in humanism in the West. And it is stated in an amazingly where there is no in Western tradition you talk about God as sort of at the beginning as the center of natural law, and then humanism ejects God out of the center. But in Islamic philosophy, there is no way you can eject God out of the center of the humanist Islamic ideal. The whole notion of Abrar is so intertwined with the divine. And there are clear philosophical reasons for why it was possible to eject God out of humanism in Christianity, or at least what secular philosophers believe was possible. But in Islam, it would absolutely, the whole thing wouldn't work. About the nudhr, yes, there are a number of traditions where a member of Ahlul Bayt is allegedly, not many, but a couple, allegedly makes a nadhr of one form or another. And I think especially when the Surah Al-Insan, the reference to observe their vows is understood as referring to the supposed nadhr that is taken about Hassan Hussein radiallahu anhum. Then it becomes this sort of theological. But does nadhr work? There's so much, both in Sunni and Shia traditions, there's so much written about a nadhr. My own take on it, because you get into all types of, is it only should be taken in the most exceptional circumstance, and with a great deal of for reservations, in the sense that you have to understand that then if Allah doesn't do what you want, that you have to accept that as what is best, and not insist on your way, because there is a certain amount of, I always felt a lack of politeness in the practice of nadr, that you are bargaining with God. If you do this, I do this, which is not my understanding of refined akhlaq. If it's one thing if Allah gives you, you're doing dua and Allah answers your dua, and then you volunteer to do all these things. But the idea of negotiating with Allah in that way has always not sat very well with me, and has always been very uncomfortable. And I've, quite frankly, I've never done it. I mean, I've been tempted to do it at times when a real hardship, or but then I just have always felt that it is not appropriate. What is appropriate is to, and what is even appropriate is that if the terms of another occur to me, then whatever way Allah decides the matter, I just volunteer what I had thought of anyway. So whether I got my way or didn't get my way, because as the Prophet ﷺ said, don't say لا تقول لو كان كذا كان كذا وكذا فإن لو تفتح عمل الشيطان. Don't say if this would have happened, this would have happened, because say if law is is opening the door to the devil. You don't know what's best, and to accept whatever Allah presents as basically saying, well, since you willed it, then it's best. I think it's always a better way of dealing with these matters. And of course it's challenging, because when it comes to like illness of a loved one, or it's hard, but still.
Sure. I'm just going this way.
Just echoing Grace and Parveen, Sheikh, thank you so much. I love how the surah doesn't dwell on hellfire punishment. It's just one ayah, just one verse. It's that other surahs can warn, but Surah Insan, the point of Surah Insan is just to inspire. Just inspire with an ideal. A question is on verse 23. وَكَانَ سَعْيُكُمْ مَشْكُورًا.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is presumably God or the angels. So
right.
It's coming from the heavens. And so it's on the nature of shukr. Because if I'm reading it correctly, then God is saying, sa'yukum, your effort, thanks, is appreciated.
Mm-hmm.
So shukr isn't just something that we have for God, it's actually reciprocal. God has shukr for us.
Yeah.
So is that not something that's kind of, a bit unique? We worship God, God doesn't worship us. We fear God, God doesn't fear us. But if we are grateful to God, and if we do our best, we don't even have to achieve it, we just sa'yukum, it's just your effort.
Yeah.
God is grateful for you, so there's a reciprocity.
No, I'm actually I'm happy you asked about this verse, because I didn't stop at it, but it is worth stopping at, and there are some riwayat that say, or opinions, they're not riwayat, but they're opinions of commentators that say that the angels will then say your endeavors are held in gratitude, or that we are that yeah, your endeavors are regarded with gratitude or held in gratitude. But there is really no reason to believe that it's the angels who are saying this, but rather it's a statement of a relational principle that, and that statement comes from Allah directly, that your endeavors, Allah holds these endeavors with gratitude, or as God is grateful for these endeavors, which is, as you said, it's very, this is unique in Islam, and this is not the only time in the Quran that you have an expression like that. But that which, I mean, Ghazali says that this is yet among the many indicators that God is not a disinterested God in who makes it or doesn't make it, but that God is truly a wadud, is one of the attributes of God, close and intimate, and that God is grateful for the endeavor, for the attempt, for the sa'i, for the path that you take. And I believe it was Ibn Arabi in Futuhat who, when asked, well, what is God grateful for? And he says, I believe it was him, but I'm not sure. And he says, well, God is grateful for not having to met the dictates of justice upon you, i.e. not having to punish you. You've saved God. Not that, God, it's not an effort, but it is the fact that there is no pleasure obtained from punishing you. And the fact that you did good by yourself is something that actually God welcomes and celebrates. And this is actually, inshallah, we'll encounter this in other parts of the Quran, where that type of very interesting relation is and it is God treats human beings. This is my perspective on it, that in Islam God treats human beings with respect, accountability, and consequences is part of treating you according to what you've earned. Respecting human beings is to give them the choice and then to treat them as adults. They do good, you welcome it, you're grateful for it, you reward them, and if they make the choice not to do good, then they bear the consequences of their actions. If God is not babying human beings as defective information. The idea that, well, human beings need to be saved from their own selves. God, as sort of, even in Christianity, where it goes to the extreme of that God must suffer to save human beings from their own follies. but the relationship in Islam is God is closer to you than you realize. God is always with you. God celebrates your victories. God is always there to help you. You take one step towards God, God takes 10 steps towards you. But ultimately, God respects your choice, better for better or for worse. And that's Sayukum Mashkura. It's and interestingly, by the way, it affects Muslim culture because in what has become part of Muslim culture is that when you go convey your condolences to someone, and they'll say Sa'ikum Mashkur, or I mean the ayah that we're grateful for your endeavors, for your effort. Or if you, in Muslim culture, normally Sa'ikum Mashkur is not said, like normally if you go to a wedding, people don't say Sa'ikum Mashkur. Normally it's on more somber occasions. But it's interesting that it has entered into Muslim culture. Of course, Muslims still corrupted it a bit because why not say it in a wedding? It's just we're grateful for your effort. That's what it means. But it permeated even common culture, although it's usually said in more somber occasions, like if you go visit someone who's ill, then when people are saying goodbye, they'll say Sa'ikum Mashkur. We're grateful for your endeavor. The idea is the idea of gratitude as a cornerstone of morality, and the fact that Allah even partakes in that by saying, I am grateful for your endeavor, is very significant.
Thank you so much, Sheikh. Yeah, I was thinking of similar things that Grace was thinking about, and I feel that I agree with her that it seems like this surah belongs to a class of Meccan surah that were concerned with the individual rather than the later surah that tend to deal with how to begin civil community building and this sort of thing. And as you were talking about the debate, whether it's Meccan or Medinan, and the discussion regarding Asir, I was thinking of other surah in which the ayahs seem to be discussing something that's forthcoming and the Muslims can't possibly know. Sometimes it's more elusive, but I mean, a clear example would be something as early as Muzammil, when it's talking about, and God knows that some of you are fighting in the path of Allah or will be fighting in the path of Allah. So clearly something that's very, obviously I know that then obviously there were also concerns on whether that's a Medinan verse or not, but it feels quite strong, and I was just wondering, does something like Muzammil help boost this argument here that this is, because even when you're reading Muzammil, it still can be read in a very general sense. Fighting in the way of God is limited only to physical fighting, or when you're thinking about the way that the Muslims were meant to serve God at the time of the revelation, everything, the whole thing was a fight in essence. And so when you're presenting this material, it feels like any type, like as you said at the end, any type of impoverishment or destitution, or that can be an asir for somebody. So I wondered if there was a similarity in that.
No, you're right. I mean, in Surah Al-Muzammil, there's a reference that clearly anticipates what will come, and we've seen this in several surah in the Meccan surah where it's talking about something that clearly, and sometimes the tradition will treat us to one of these rare situations where it will tell us about the Meccans mocking, mocking an ayah in the Quran because they think, you guys think you're going to have X, Y, and Z, and so, and that's one of the rare occasions where it's actually the enemy, the opponent, helps situate the surah, and I think that's why in the notes that I mentioned at the beginning, that's why I ended up concluding that, or leaning towards the opinion that it's Meccan. Because the reference to the Asir, it could easily fall within the categories of ayat where it's saying something that, even if it meant war captives, just solely war captives, that it's anticipating what's going to happen. And we don't have with this, in this occasion, we don't have some riwayah about Meccan mocking the reference, but we do have these reports where the Prophet ﷺ says that someone in your debt is your asir. And I suspect, if I just imagine what the context would have been, is that I suspect that they probably in Mecca, that he was asked, well, what asir? We don't have war captives. And that the Prophet ﷺ then elaborated that, well, there's no reason for you to take it so literally, that there are all types of situations where people are effectively your asir. And because it's asir, it's not, it's not that it's been used in Arabic to describe other than war captives. This is like Prophet ﷺ saying that, well, you don't have to take it so literally, and giving it that broader meaning. And so, and if if you're thinking as sort of like a historian, you'd say, well, probably that elaboration came because people were wondering, well, why is it saying that when we are, in Mecca, persecuted? But I think you're absolutely right on that it is. I mean, once you go through the surah and you realize that, I mean, and you go through the entire process of that it is saying something so critical about an insan and setting this ideal, and then it becomes, you just, your heart feels like this is more Meccan than Medina. I'm not, I've tried to delve into why the second generation of interpreters thought it's Medinan, but other than the reference to Asir, or because they were leaning towards accepting the riwayah about Hassan Hussein being ill, and especially those who said this Medina, in the riwayah, that among those who fast, Hassan Hussein themselves fast, so they were old enough to fast. Which, if so, then it would be Medina. And if it's, and that especially those who said it's Medina said that they borrowed the wheat, that they made the bread from a Jewish neighbor, and a Jewish neighbor again would place in Medina. But that riwayah is questionable, including the borrowing from a Jewish neighbor. I mean, why would they? I mean, no Muslim had had wheat, and it was a type. There's sort of this type of riwayat after a number of Jewish converts enter Islam, where we have this prototype where a Muslim is always borrowing something from a Jew. You know, whether wheat, whether shield, whether a sword or horse, and so on. Which again, it makes you a bit suspect. You know, I'm sure there was some borrowing from Jews, but I don't think it was as extensive as the Jewish converts to Islam seem to relate. Yeah, I know. I think all of that is, and the asir is not, you know, is not decisive as some of these commentators seem to think it is. I just want to say something about the point that you made about. See, Surah, I think you're absolutely right that, you know, it's gradations, because I remember this question where someone said that the answer was all underwhelming and so on. Is that when Surah Al-Insan, it's like if you to try to tell someone that the purpose is to be among the Abrar without going through the entire explanation of how and why is a fool's errand. And you start out with the simple, flat answer of, well, you know, life on earth is a test. Well, yeah, seeking to be among the Abrar is a test. But the test is not the objective. It is a higher, more refined point to say that the objective is to come to know your Lord, is consciousnness without God is as meaningless as the birth of a star in the huge universe and the death of a star in the huge universe. You know, if it just comes and it goes. And yeah, sure, it might look wonderful, it might look spectacular, it might do wonderful, you know, amazing energy, whatever. But without there being God, it's still an empty, vast universe in which things just happen and things just disappear. And when you realize that consciousness was given so that you aspire towards your divine origin, and that God is grateful for you to reach out to your source, your root, it's a completely different outlook. Incidental to that is the test. So, I mean, I remember thinking to myself that maybe because I remember my response to that, and I wanted to make a humbling point, to humble people when they sort of like say, well, oh, we're just here to be tested. But I remember thinking to myself, you know, it's actually a good point. It is underwhelming. but you know, you just let it go, or leave it to a later time.
Sure.
I'm wondering if, in the spirit of your halakas on, like with Surah Takwir or Surah Waqia, that usually traditional tafsir would interpret that as being a description of a final day, that actually it's a description of something in this life. If there's room in this surah to look at that in the same way, because like as we were going through and I'm looking at the language, I don't think it says garden at one point. I mean, it does say Jannah, but for the most part, like especially in the beginning, it says that the pious drink of a cup, not that the pious will drink of a cup. It seems to, is there room for interpretation that this is describing the actual state of the Abrar and the Kuffar, or the sinners? Because I'm also thinking in terms of the halakha in Surah Yasin, that it later describes people on this earth as being shackled. Mm-hmm. And that maybe it's not, when it says that we have prepared shackles and chains and a blazing fire, it's not in the sense of present tense versus future tense, but in the sense of I've created these things, but you're the one who puts them on. I've just created the parameters for these things too, and it might appear to you that you're because of your existence, because of all the veils, it might appear to you that you're fine and that you're having your needs met because your whole life is about chasing these different things. But the reality is that these pious people that you see who are hungry and who don't have as much and who you are judging, their reality is actually this. And your reality is actually one which is shackled and in chains and is in absence of God, which is like a blazing fire. The difference is on your death, that veil is going to be lifted and you're going to see it for what it is. But to me, I'm wondering if there's room for interpretation that it's basically saying like this is already how it is. This is the reality of it.
Yeah. Okay, it's not in the Nashi. The reason I paused, I was looking at, is that I did read somewhere that when it says إن أعتدنا للكافرين سلاسل وأغلالا وسعيرا, that I did read that these chains already exist on earth, that basically they've chained themselves, like they've put these chains on themselves, and that and there was one of the Sufi tafsir, but I don't remember, maybe tafsir al-Najmi. I think it probably is. Anyway, that it is just the veil is lifted, and then they see the chains that they've placed upon themselves through their commitment to materialism and I didn't emphasize this in this tafsir because, well, I mean, on the one hand, I did say that, it's when in the hereafter they see the reality of what they've done to themselves. But I didn't carry that theme through, partly because there is so much emphasis on that كأسا كان مزاجها كافورا عينا تسمى سلسبيلا, that it is describing an ultra reality, something that we have no frame of reference to. But I can imagine that if you're going to understand these metaphorically, you could find parallels to that state. And in fact, a lot of in the Sufi tradition, they'll often describe they'll find these as metaphors to stages of development on this earth in enlightenment, paralleling what a continued state of development in the hereafter would be. So I think you're right. There is a way, and especially that reference to أغلال وسلاسل وأغلال وسعيرة, and the most what stands out, like Ibn al-Arabi says that that so many people, the reason that they become addicted to distractions is because they create the sa'ir in their lives. That in fact the fire is already blazing in their life. And the reason human beings covet more and more material things, they do so just to distract themselves because the fire is under them. And if they stop consuming, they'll notice that the fire is under them. And so that is all like goes to the same theme that you're suggesting. So yeah, that's a good point.
So, we have a question from Enjam. Professor, first of all, let me just say, she wrote something very nice. She really appreciates these holotypes. I appreciate your words, quote, most of our immorality is because we are confused about what rights we owe others and what rights we feel entitled to. There seems to be a fundamental problem with masses, especially in American culture, heavily focusing on rights talk, grasping the problem. How do we make this more of a mainstream discourse to move away from just rights talks, which is often linked to self-interest, towards greater, broader societal and even global human obligations and duties as equally needed? It's almost as if questioning emphasis on rights alone has become taboo, but few want to discuss the other side of the coin.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. I know that in the field of human rights, there is a whole school. It's not as powerful as because it's not backed up by any big institutions, but there's a whole discourse that is that has a great deal of respectability in scholarship, that are often called Asian rights or humanitarian conceptions of rights. And the thing that have always struck me as I read this material is a lot of the scholars who've challenged the classic Western rights talk, and proposed philosophically justified notions of what they've called Asian rights or communal rights, have come from normally Buddhist backgrounds and normally converts to Buddhism. Or people who are, of Chinese or background or Taiwanese background or something like that. And I've always, when I read this, this material, I always think to myself, I wish it was Muslims who were making these interventions. I wish that, but it requires that you present your arguments in terms that can be engaged scholarly, not in terms that are entirely self-referential with a lot of citations to Quran and Hadith. But it demonstrates how the extent to which we have not lived up to what our tradition empowers us to offer. This discourse should be something that is recognized as a Muslim intervention, and So it is, but I mean, making an intervention in the field of rights talk as an academic level is one thing, but just even getting Muslims to understand, and I'm talking about the way we raise our children, the way we educate, to get the Muslims who are going to college and becoming intellectuals to get to be excited about the fact that their religion offers something that's coherent and something that's respectable and something that's honorable, and to get them excited about exploring the meaning of this and the implications of this, and not just becoming imitators and falling in the, you know, it requires that we introduce them to a level of sophistication so that they can feel that this tradition is rich, and that they can plow this tradition, and that if they plow it, that it in fact will make their efforts worthwhile. In other words, that they're going to plow it and they're going to not hit rock bottom and find an impoverished tradition with nothing to offer, because everything that surrounds us, from you know, the way Islam is taught at school level, to Islam and Islamic centers, to it doesn't inspire confidence in our new generations. I mean, they most don't even think in terms of, and even when we present them, like, I can't tell you like how many times I've heard in Islamic centers things like, say, oh, the community has rights. In Islam, we focus not on rights but on duties. Well, that's a fallacy as well, because no, that's a wrong way of phrasing it. If you focus on duties and not on rights, well, one, that's not the Islamic tradition. Remember, the Islamic tradition is the one that, before all else, spoke about حقوق العباد and حقوق الله and so on. And they phrased it in terms of حقوق. And second is, in the mind of youth who grow up in the society, societies that talk about duties and only duties are totalitarian or authoritarian societies. So they associate that type of talk with authoritarianism or totalitarianism. And so, I mean, I've heard it even from people that I would have thought they know better. In other words, people that tended to be more sophisticated Muslims. But still, they go to the youth group and they'll say, in Islam, it's all about duties, it's not about rights. Or if they talk about rights, they don't have something beyond that to tell them, to tie it into anything more sophisticated and more nuanced than just say, yeah, in Islam, everyone has their rights, and it's a right person in the right place, and this is what Islam is about. It is part of what, you know, what if Allah would, if I would hope will eventually bear fruit, is to find Muslims able to engage these issues at a far more sophisticated level, and to make real contributions to humanity in real crisis. Because we live in a world where Milton Friedman's economic models have become the dominant economic models in the world. And if you know anything about Milton Friedman's economics, it has nothing to do with, it's exactly the exact antithesis of Quranic morality. And all the real critiques of Milton Friedman's economic models and their hegemonic influence in the world come from socialist circles, Marxist circles, Buddhist circles, and the Islamic. In fact, most Muslim countries have embraced, maybe with the exception of some periods in Indonesian history or some periods in Malaysian history, in modern history, but for the most part, Muslims have just completely, as immoral as it is. So, what do you do in a country like Egypt where the government is going around destroying the homes of poor people and in the name of economic development and, throwing thousands upon thousands of people in the streets in the name of the free market and capitalism? And then you still, so many Muslims, and this, I realize that this point is a matter of personal bitterness for me. That then you find so many Muslims still going around defending this type of brutality as somehow consistent with Islam. And you have institutions like Azhar completely silent. Or the Neom project in Saudi Arabia, where the government comes in and kicked all these people out of their homes to create a free market zone, or following the Dubai and Abu Dhabi model, which it's hard to imagine something more un-Islamic than the Dubai and Abu Dhabi model. I always go back to we are as good as the mutrafin, the high class. If the high class spend their money and where their money should go, things will start changing for us. If the high class continue wasting our resources in idiotic endeavors, then we are stuck in the rut we're in for the foreseeable future. If they continue creating substandard intellectual institutions, institutions that don't compete, and everyone knows that they don't compete, but we all play these like make-believe games. Let this person pretend to be a professor, let this person pretend to be competitive in the open market, and we all know that they're not. And we all know that it's all, when it comes to Islam, we all live in a world of make-believe. That's hard. That's very, I think I'm going to leave this world with a lot of sadness in my heart because of that.
Okay, thank you. I know we're pretty much out of time. I just wanted to raise this one question that came out. I hope it's a fast answer. If not, then we can hold off. But this is from Surah Waqiah last week, where we talked about heaven, and I figured it tied into what we're talking about today a little bit. But someone was asking about the hadith of Salama, about when you go to heaven and if the man gets back together with all the women he has married in this life, the woman has to choose one of all of her husbands as opposed to the man who gets all of his wives. First, is that correct, or did men invent it to oppress women? And because it seems very misogynist, and this is one of the things that this person has been struggling with for years and is a source of doubt. So.
SubhanAllah. You see, this is where, this person, if they've been struggling with this for years and it's a source of doubt, SubhanAllah, this is where, again, living proof on when I talk about how the problem is with our educational institutions. Because if there were proper educational institutions, then it would have been possible for this person to find out fairly quickly that this hadith attributed to Salama, where she asked the Prophet والسلام, that okay, a woman marries several husbands, so what happens in the hereafter? And he says, well, she picked the husband she loved the most and she lived with him. That this hadith occurs in a number of versions. Several versions, it's she picks the husband that she wants to live with, and that's it. In other versions, the hadiths continue to go on to say, well, a woman picks a husband that is her, that she loved the most, while a man lives with all his wives that the man ever married in their lifetime. Well, that addition to the report, this is a situation where several hadith scholars said that the root, meaning the original riwayah about Salama asking about husbands and getting a written response, that part, a number of scholars, also it's ahad, also it's singular transmission, but still, they said that it has this authentic chain. The annex, the addition that says, well, a man gets all his wives, that has been pretty much universally recognized as daif, as weak, meaning invented. So that's one level, one response. The other thing is that a husband doesn't get to live with the wives, whether, meaning in heaven, whether the wives want to live with the husband or not. So, I mean, a woman makes it to heaven if she doesn't like her husband anymore in heaven. Says, I don't want to see his face. There's nothing. There's a lot of evidence that says, well, she's not going to be forced to live with someone in heaven that she didn't want to live with. So that's the problem was that riwayah that says live with all the way, it doesn't qualify it as to whether these wives would want to live with the husband or not. Third, I believe that the Salama riwayah itself, where the Prophet ﷺ says, you choose the husband that is not of the degree of authenticity that we can build a matter of aqidah, a matter of theology on its basis. Because if you, when it comes to aqaid, when it comes to theology, in my school of thought, you need a much higher level of authenticity to rely on a report. Companionship is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when Allah speaks about azwaj, there is a lot of evidence that it is a harmonious relationship between two people. Now, the laws that apply to this world do not apply in heaven. So we put it very bluntly. Let's assume that a woman goes in heaven and she had two husbands that she loved equally. And these two husbands in heaven said, we want to live with this woman. There is no pregnancy. Why is it that polygamy, or what is it called when a woman marries more than one husband? There's a term for it. Anyway, there's no pregnancy. There is no children. There is no virginity in the earthly terms of it. So what possible reason can one cite that a woman can't live with more than one husband if that's what they want? that sort of misogynistic logic of no, you know, it's improper in this world for a woman to have more than one husband, so it must be so in the hereafter. That's, as you know, and that's because we assume that between husband and wife in the hereafter would be like what we have in this world, sexual relations of the nature that we have in this world. And I think that's a completely unjustified assumption. In other words, you live with your partner in harmony. That doesn't mean that, you know, they're going to schedule their date night, you know, every Saturday or you know, or every whatever it is, and you know, and it's being stuck in the materialistic way of thinking about things, the earthly way of thinking about things. So then, if I tell you there's no sex involved, but just harmonious companionship, you wouldn't have a problem with a woman having more than one husband in the hereafter. You have a problem because you think, oh, sexually. But to superimpose our sexual logic upon the hereafter is quite unfortunate. So don't let that give you a crisis of faith. Is it misogyny? Yeah, it is misogyny. The misogyny is all over the tradition because it's interpreted through human agents, and the human agents that interpreted the tradition were men. And men can't imagine sharing a woman by the earthly logic. They can imagine a woman sharing a man, but they can't imagine a woman sharing different men or having different men. And that muscling the hereafter or forcing the hereafter into our earthly logic is really unfortunate, really and unwarranted. So don't let that give you any type of crisis of faith. It's not worth it. It's yeah.
Okay, alhamdulillah, thank you. Thank you so much, everybody, for another amazing session. This was really, truly special, alhamdulillah, and I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of the weekend, and inshallah, we will see you on Tuesday for next surah, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum. Great to see you.